The neighborhood on the edge of the small town had always been quiet, except for one house that stood apart from the rest. It wasn't the house itself that caught people's attention, but the shabby wooden shed sitting at the corner of the yard. The shed looked as if it had been built decades ago and never repaired. Its roof sagged on one side, the paint peeled away, and sometimes at night, a dim light flickered through its cracks. Everyone in the neighborhood wondered why the old shed was still standing. Living in that house was a woman named Clara. She was in her late 50s, with gray streaks in her hair and hands that showed years of hard work. Clara lived alone, and most of the neighbors never saw her leave the property except for quick trips to the small grocery store in town. She was quiet, polite when spoken to, but she rarely joined in community events. What drew even more attention was how much time she spent in that shed. Morning, afternoon, evening, whenever someone passed her house, they would see Clara either carrying something into the shed or sitting inside with the door slightly open. Some neighbors joked that she might be hiding treasure. Others claimed she was simply eccentric. Children whispered that maybe she was a witch brewing potions in there. Adults laughed about it when they gathered at the coffee shop, shaking their heads at the strange woman with her strange shed. At first the laughter was light-hearted, but soon it grew crueler, mocked her behind her back, sometimes even in front of her. Teenagers passing by would shout, "Hey, shed lady, what are you building in there?" or laugh loudly whenever they saw her carrying boxes. Clara never replied. She would just lower her head and continue her walk, clutching whatever she carried, as if she didn't hear them at all. But the truth was, Clara heard everything, and every word of mockery cut deep inside her heart. She had lived in that neighborhood for over 20 years, and yet she was still treated as an outsider. No one knew her story. No one cared to ask why she spent so much time in the shed. It was easier for them to laugh than to understand. One Saturday morning, a group of neighbors gathered outside the house across the street from Clara's. They were talking and sipping coffee when Clara came out of her home, dragging a cart full of wooden planks toward the shed. "Look at that," one of the men whispered with a smirk. "She's building her castle in there." Another woman laughed. "Maybe she's preparing for the end of the world." The group chuckled, and a couple of children joined in, imitating Clara's walk, exaggerating the way she bent under the weight of the planks. Clara kept moving, though her face was red. Once inside the shed, she closed the door firmly. The laughter outside continued. None of them imagined that the shed hid something extraordinary, something that would silence every mocking word they had ever spoken. Clara's shed was far from ordinary. Inside, the smell of wood and paint mixed with the faint scent of old books. Along the walls, shelves were filled with tools, cans of paint, brushes, and stacks of papers. In the middle of the room stood a long wooden table covered with sketches and blueprints. On another side of the shed, wooden boards leaned against the wall, some already carved with delicate patterns. For years, Clara had been working on something. Few could imagine she was building intricate wooden toys, furniture, and miniature models. Her late husband, Richard, had once been a carpenter, and together they had dreamed of opening a workshop that could bring joy to children and families. But Richard had passed away unexpectedly, leaving Clara with nothing but memories and his old tools. While others might have sold the tools or let them gather dust, Clara couldn't. She felt closest to him when she worked with wood, shaping it with the same care he once did. What started as a way to cope with her grief slowly turned into a mission. Clara decided to keep alive the dream she and Richard once shared. Every day she worked in the shed. Sometimes late into the night she carved little animals from wood, painted rocking horses, and built dollhouses with delicate details that looked like real homes in miniature. Other times she crafted chairs, tables, or shelves, each one made with patience and skill. She wasn't just making objects, she was creating art that carried love in every stroke of her hand. But Clara never told the neighbors. She never invited them inside. In her heart, she feared that if they mocked her for simply being in the shed, they would surely laugh even harder at her creations. And so, she kept her world private, building quietly, while the laughter outside grew louder. The turning point came one autumn afternoon. The local community center had announced a charity fair to raise funds for underprivileged children in town. People were encouraged to donate items for sale clothes, books, baked goods, anything that could help raise money. Flyers went up across the neighborhood, and everyone talked about what they would contribute. When Clara received the flyer in her mailbox, she paused for a long time. She held the paper in her hand, staring at the words. For years she had hidden her work, but something in her heart whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was the moment to share it. After all, Richard had always wanted their work to bring happiness to children. She spent the next week working harder than ever. She built a small wooden rocking horse painted in bright red and blue. She crafted a dollhouse with 4 tiny rooms, complete with hand-painted windows and doors. She carved little animals, dogs, cats, horses, and even a small wooden train with wheels that really turned. On the morning of the fair, Clara packed her creations into boxes and carried them out, one by one. The neighbors, as always, were watching. "Would you look at that?" a man muttered. "She's finally moving her stuff out of that shed. Maybe she's clearing it out for the rats," someone else joked. Clara ignored them. The boxes into her old car and drove to the community center when the fair began. People wandered from table to table looking at baked goods, clothes, and crafts. But soon, a crowd began to gather around one particular table, the one where Clara had laid out her wooden creations. Children gasped in delight as they saw the dollhouse and the train. Parents marveled at the craftsmanship, running their hands over the smooth wood. Within an hour, every single piece was sold. The organizers were astonished. Clara's donations had raised more money than any other table at the fair. People asked her where she had bought such beautiful things, and when she shyly explained that she had made them herself, their eyes widened in surprise. "Made them yourself? But how? These are incredible," one woman exclaimed. Clara smiled softly and said, "In my shed." Word spread quickly through the town. The very next day, people who had once laughed at her began to approach her with curiosity. Some apologized for their earlier jokes. Others asked if she could make something for them, a rocking chair, a toy for their child, a bookshelf. Clara, though hesitant at first, agreed. And so the shed that had once been the subject of ridicule became a place of wonder. Neighbors who had never stepped inside finally saw it with their own eyes. They were stunned by the rows of creations, the careful organization, the beauty of the work Clara had hidden for so long. The laughter stopped. In its place came admiration and respect. Children loved visiting Clara's shed, watching her carve toys, and sometimes she'll let them paint small pieces themselves. Parents praised her skill, and soon she was receiving orders not just from neighbors, but from people across town. Clara had never sought recognition, when in time her shed became famous. Local newspapers wrote about her, calling her the woman who turned an old shed into a place of magic. Schools invited her to teach woodworking workshops. Even nearby towns began to ask for her creations. But for Clara, the greatest reward wasn't the recognition or the money. It was the joy on children's faces when they held her toys, the happiness in families who bought her furniture, and the knowledge that she had kept Richard's dream alive. Years later, the shed still stood in her yard, but it was no longer. Seen as shabby or strange, it was painted freshly, with flowers planted around it, and a sign above the door that read, "Richard's Workshop, where dreams are built." The same neighbors who had once mocked her now proudly told visitors about the talented woman who lived among them. They brought their children to see her, bought her creations as gifts, and even helped her expand the shed into a larger workshop. Clara often thought back to those days when people laughed at her, and she carried wood into the shed with their eyes mocking her every step. She realized that sometimes people laugh at what they don't understand, but the truth once revealed has the power to silence every cruel word. The shed had once been a symbol of loneliness and ridicule. Now it stood as a symbol of love, creativity, and perseverance. And Clara, the woman once called Shed Lady, had become the heart of the neighborhood she had once felt so distant from. The neighbors laughed at the woman in the old shed until they walked inside and saw the truth. And once they saw it, they never laughed again.